When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
You're listening to What She Said with me, Candace Sampson, and this is your weekly reminder to take up big space in life, laugh loudly, absorb new knowledge, and continue to grow and expand. What She Said is your space for the big conversations that matter and the little joys that make life sweeter. This is where empowerment meets self-care and mansplaining has no seat at the table. So grab a coffee, get comfy, and let's jump into it because life's too short not to embrace the good stuff while we tackle the tough stuff. Most of us spend our lives trying to figure out how to hold on to our money. Emma Davis is spending hers figuring out how to give it away. So when she decided the tax system wasn't doing a good enough job, she mailed a personal check for $1 million to the Receiver General of Canada, noted it as a gift, and waited. Nobody called, not even to ask if she was okay. Emma is a member of Patriotic Millionaires Canada, a non-partisan organization of wealthy Canadians who are lobbying loudly and publicly for the government to tax them more. And before you picture some out-of-touch heiress making grand gestures from her compound, let me stop you right there, because Emma is not that. Money may have changed her circumstances, but it did not change her. In this episode, we talk a lot about the gap between the wealthy and the rest of us, and sure, the gap is real, and it is the whole point of this conversation. But there is another kind of gap, the one we build in our heads, where the wealthy become so othered that we stop seeing them as people we could ever actually talk to. And sure, there are a few who definitely won't listen. But as Emma points out, there are many who are not only listening, but are demanding change. Emma grew up with eat the rich values. She married a guy whose startup got acquired and suddenly found herself on the other side of a line she never expected to cross. And instead of going quiet about it, she got loud. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't surprised by how disarming Emma is. I could envision sitting down for lunch with her and having a robust conversation on everything from what's new on TV to the capital gains inclusion rate, except that she'd be picking up the tab, of course. I think you're going to really like this conversation, and you might even find yourself cheering on a millionaire by the end of it. Let's hear what she said. Emma, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion, so we're going to jump right in. Most people who have money are trying to figure out how to keep more of it. So what made you go in the opposite direction?
Yeah, it's nice to meet with you today, Candace, and thanks for just jumping right in. I think the really short answer to this question is I don't want to be rich in a country where people are struggling to make ends meet. And I think that the way that I approach this is in no small part because of my upbringing. I didn't grow up rich. I totally know how it feels to stress about, paying your taxes every spring. And then when my family's financial situation changed, it didn't change my belief that there's a level of wealth that's too much, that's damaging to society and democracy. At this point in my life, I live in a really small, close-knit town. I have friends across the economic spectrum. I think that gives me a fairly unique vantage point. And I see my friends and neighbors making impossible choices between rent and food and medicine and other basic needs while my wealth is growing. Even more than that, I'm worried about the impact of extreme wealth inequality on Canada's social cohesion, the economy, and ultimately on the democracy that we all we'll take care of. My husband and I wouldn't have achieved this level of wealth without public investment in our education and our healthcare and our infrastructure, our housing. And despite that, I see over and over how the tax code in Canada is designed not only so that I can increase my wealth, but also to keep me from paying my fair share. So it's clear that something is broken, and I find it really quite unbearable to witness without taking some kind of action. People like us who have benefited the most from these public investments should be picking up a bigger piece of the tab. So yeah, I'm happy to be part of a growing community of wealthy Canadians who feel the same way.
It feels like a rarity to come across somebody like you who has wealth. I mean, I think for most of us, it feels like the ladder is being pulled up behind the broligarchs and the oligarchs. And, we hear it every day. And the sort of the injustice of it all, as most people are struggling. So you actually overpaid your taxes to CRA this year as a statement. So walk me through that decision. What was the amount? What did you do? And what did the CRA actually do with it?
Yeah, so I mailed a $1 million personal check to the Receiver General of Canada. I noted on the check that it was a gift to Canada as opposed to a payment on my tax account. And I included a sticky note saying it was to be allocated in the same way that tax payments are. Basically, I followed the instructions on the CRA website. It's not super common. Public Services and Procurement Canada recorded total donations to the Crown in 24-25, around 300 grand, and about half that last year. And as far as
So nobody called you and said, "Are you okay?" You seem to have made a mistake here. Nobody called you.
No one called me. As far as next steps, I'm going to get a tax receipt for this donation, which I will not use because that would defeat the purpose of voluntarily paying extra tax.
Exactly. So for people who haven't heard of Patriotic Millionaires, the organization in which you belong and how I found you, the first reaction, I think, is usually sort of this eye-rolling skepticism. Oh, sure, rich people saying they want to be taxed, we're skeptical as a society. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, I think we have a gap in Canada between public perception and the reality of how wealthy people, most of us, feel about taxation. One thing that Patriotic Millionaires does is gather data about support for wealth taxation. And so here, I'll share some stats that might surprise your listeners. A poll last year of about 200 Canadian millionaires. So that's folks who have more than $1 million in asset, not including their home, their primary residence. 65% of Canadian millionaires surveyed believe the government should raise taxes on the very wealthy to reduce inequality, fund improved public services, address the cost of living crisis. 71% believe extreme wealth concentration is a threat to democracy. And 74% believe that the extremely wealthy disproportionately influence public opinion through control of the media. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, because that 65% is sort of in line with the average Canadian's thought that taxes should be raised, which is about 76%. That's very close. Yes. So I'm wondering who is driving this massive disconnect then? Is it the billionaires? Is it, people with like an obscene amount of wealth who can control those things?
Yeah, I think the reality is that a very small handful of wealthy Canadians with very loud voices are making the rest of us look bad, frankly, and perpetuating this idea that people aren't capable of acting outside their own economic short-term self-interest. But I think, most people can see that fair taxation is in rich people's self-interest because we all benefit when our democracy and our economy are stronger. I think there's also something at play that's maybe a bit unintuitive for most people, most Canadians, folks who really would feel an increase to their taxes. For someone who's, let's say, even upper middle class, when they imagine their taxes going up, that would have a real impact on them. They'd have to make some adjustments. And so it's hard to welcome someone imagining that, which I understand that. But after a certain point, you have so much money that you don't even think about money in the same way. And how you allocate the bulk of your wealth is utterly divorced from your everyday life. It's like almost like a game to try to increase your net wealth or buy a bigger yacht or even donate it to causes you're passionate about. But it's kind of an abstract intellectual choice at that point. it's not cutting into your champagne budget.
Right.
So, increasing taxes for the ultra wealthy, it's not asking these folks to undergo hardship. It's not even going to be perceptible in terms of their lifestyle to them. So whoever the small, loud, vocal minority is, I think we can ignore them and get on with it, because at the end of the day, wealthy Canadians aren't the ones who get to decide if this country is going to bring in wealth taxes. Voters are.
Exactly. So, I mean, I imagine the most common pushback then is people saying, well, I mean, if you believe this so much, why don't you just write a check like you did? 65% of the millionaires agree with this. So why don't they just write a check to CRA like you did instead of waiting for the legislation to come through?
Yeah, I do hear that response. The reality is, one rich person like me choosing to pay an appropriate amount of tax, it's not going to move the needle on the affordability crisis or solve the national daycare shortage. We can't solve entrenched structural problems that we're facing with a few individual actions. Tax code is designed to be mandatory and universally applied. And so only using the tax code effectively scales enough to have real impact and is distributed in a coordinated way. My check is just the beginning. I mean, I'm hoping this is going to shift public understanding around tax. There are these things that people respond to with, oh, you can't say that. But the only reason you can't say it is because no one's been saying it. And I really think we should be saying tax the rich. I think we should all be saying no one needs to be a billionaire like Billie Eilish.
Yes.
Taxation, it's not a punishment. It's not theft. It's not a dirty word. It's an integral tool of democracy, like voting. It's a duty, but it's also a privilege to contribute to our collective well-being.
And I think,
That's how I see it.
we're looking right now at, somebody in the United States like Zoran Mamdani, who is actually proving in real time, we've been hearing for years and years and years, oh, it's not possible. You can't do that. And he's been in a few months and the change, he's got rid of the deficit. He's taxed the rich. Things are improving for New Yorkers. So, I mean, it can be done. And I think, like you said, I think it's showing the way that people need to see it can be done and what the impact will be. So the organization Patriotic Millionaires is American, but the Canadian chapter opened in last year, May of 2025. So why was that the right moment to sort of push into Canada, especially, I might add, considering everything going on between Canada and the U.S. right now? Is there some sort of connection there? Like, what is that conversation like across the border?
They're separate organizations. We're not, we're not an offshoot of Patriotic Millionaires U.S. separate organizations.
Okay.
And there's actually a UK organization that comes before the Canadian chapter. So,
excellent.
We're the third, and there are similar organizations in other parts in Europe, in other countries. They don't share the name; they're not as closely related, but with very similar mandates. In terms of why this is the right time, I think those of us who are kind of founding members of Patriotic Millionaires have been paying a lot of attention to what's been happening in the U.S. and really see the kind of growing oligarchy in the U.S. as a bellwether, and so there's a sense of urgency to not let the same thing happen here. And a lot of the kind of momentum in this group in Canada came around the proposed increase to the capital gains inclusion rate. So that was kind of the catalyst that got this in motion.
Well, let's talk about it. I mean, I even kind of pains me a little bit to ask it because I'm a big fan of Mark Carney, but I'm going to come after him a little bit here because he canceled the capital gains inclusion rate increase his first week in office. That change would have primarily hit wealthier Canadians like yourself. So what did that moment feel like from inside an organization like yours?
Yeah, I was so disappointed to see the cancellation of the capital gains inclusion rate increase. It's a mouthful for folks who maybe don't necessarily have their heads around what exactly that entails, and we can speak a little bit about that if that's useful. But I don't have any special insight into what makes Carney tick. We can all read his book. We see the Davos speech. I think there's maybe, there seems to be a bit of a gap between some of the messaging that comes out and the way that he's governing. And it's hard to know if he thought that it was a bad idea or he just didn't feel like arguing the case. Folks might remember he said he was going to abandon it as part of his leadership campaign. So that's when we were first seeing the waves of a well-coordinated, well-funded attack against it from tech billionaires. And we heard the same thing from Minister Freeland, and her finance ministry was who developed the proposal in the first place. So yeah, it's not clear. Carney also scrapped the yacht tax, which was levied on boats worth more than $250,000. I don't need a tax break when I buy a yacht. I mean, these kinds of luxury taxes are the exact kind of progressive policy we need more of.
Yeah, like, could we get a tax break on, like, I don't know, our bus pass? These are the things that should be handed out to people, not a yacht tax. And I can't help but think, who is driving that conversation, if not you and the people that you know? Who is driving that conversation to stop these things from coming through? That's what really bothers me, because then you start to wonder what other influence are they having in our daily lives that we may not be aware of. So let's look at what's happening in Canada right now. So StatsCan says the income gap is at a record high. I'm sure, as you know, the top 40% versus the bottom 40% is 46.7 percentage points. That's crazy to me. 89 Canadian billionaires grew their wealth by over 20% in 1 year. Meanwhile, 25% of Canadians are food insecure. So when you lay out those numbers, what are you feeling?
Yeah, I mean, we can't keep going like this. And I definitely see correlation. I mean, Canada is not a poor country, but it's a country with a lot of people living below the poverty line, and even above that threshold, folks really who are just struggling. We all know we're in the middle of an affordability crisis. And the concentration of Canadian wealth has just gotten more and more intense over the last several years. Yeah, I mean, those kinds of stats, and there's so many different ways you can look at those numbers, and they're all stark. They're all startling. 40% of the bottom 40% of Canadians hold 3.3% of the total wealth in the country. The top 0.01% hold more than that at 5.7%. So the rich get richer. And people like the Westons, the Sobeys, the Pattersons, who own our large grocery chains and are some of Canada's wealthiest families, they should be taxed more. And instead, wealth is being funneled away from people who work for a living, like the essential workers that we all saw in COVID in our grocery stores, to those who have capital and who own these big businesses. There are a lot of reasons that wealth inequality keeps getting more and more severe. The tax code isn't the whole story here, but the tax code is making things worse, and it's privileging the ownership class and driving more and more inequality and the affordability crisis. So as I see it, tax policy is one of the tools that we have for shifting that power back in the other direction.
So the Fraser Institute, which is right-leaning, really, they're on this, they say Canada's wealthy already pay a lot. They point to the top earners contribute a significant share of total tax revenue by absolute dollars. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to how you assess your, what is an appropriate contribution, and how you kind of think about that obligation. Or I really think about it as a debt. My personal situation, I'm not going to say that my husband didn't work hard, but that's not why we're rich. Lots of people work much harder, never see anything like the kind of wealth that we now have. We're very, very lucky. But even saying that doesn't acknowledge the fact that, our fortune, and I really can speak only to my personal story, but there was public investment in our education. We both went to public school. We went to public universities. In housing, my husband's family lived in the False Creek Co-op, which is an incredible example of Canada getting public housing so right. Investment in entrepreneurship. My husband's startup took investment capital from a public pension plan, and there were Canadian R&D tax credits that reimbursed large parts of their payroll. So this is, that's my story, but this is true for all wealthy Canadians. We all rely on our workers and customers having access to public infrastructure to get to work, to get to shop, to stay healthy, to get an education. So as I see it, working and middle-class Canadians, even moderately wealthy people, they're doing their part to pay for the libraries and the hospitals and the courts and the public institutions that make a functioning democracy possible. And it's time for rich people to reinvest to build a sustainable and equitable future, to contribute to the lives of all Canadians, to tackle inequality, to strengthen democracy, and invest in public services that take care of everybody. those who have benefited the most have a duty to pay the most.
So what is the actual policy ask then of Patriotic Millionaires?
So there is not a specific, as I understand, there is not a specific kind of policy being put forward by Patriotic Millionaires at this point. There are other organizations in Canada who do that kind of real kind of wonk work. And so I can share some of the proposals from the BC Society for Policy Solutions. We have some evidence about like, if we did this, it would generate that much wealth. So I can share some of those numbers if you think that would be interesting. And then the federal government has also done some of their own work around. So for example, the Parliamentary Budget Officer analyzed an NDP wealth tax proposal that looked at 1% on household net worth over $10 million and up to $50 million, and then 2% on household net worth over $50 million and up to $100 million, and 3% on household worth over $100 million. And they estimated that they would bring in $121 million in net revenue over a 5-year window with that proposal. So I think that's a great example of the kind of numbers that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's not hard to look at this and say that, you know, if we were taxing appropriately, we would be so much better off. And so I think it's a good time to kind of move into some of the myths around this, because whoever is orchestrating the pushback on taxes is doing a very good job with propaganda, convincing people, that we shouldn't be taxing the rich. I mean, it always blows my mind when you see the poorest of the poor defending the wealthy. I can't get past that sometimes. But the biggest one, I think, is sort of this tax us and we'll leave mentality that we hear a lot. Oh, you're going to tax me? I'm going to leave Canada, which always makes me kind of laugh because I think, well, where are you going? By all means go, but where are you going exactly if you think it's so much better, right? So a Cornell sociologist, as I was researching this, named Cristobal Young, he spent years looking at IRS tax returns in the States, millions of them really, and he tracked what wealthy people actually do when their taxes go up. And so do you know what the research actually shows?
I would love to hear it because I don't. I mean, I could take an educated guess, but I don't know.
Yeah. So 95% of billionaires live where they're born. They move less than average people. And they cluster sort of in high tax states, which I guess we would call blue states, or in Canada, more liberal leaning places. So the research doesn't support the idea that they're going to up and leave. I mean, I don't think a single millionaire or billionaire has left New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I'm not surprised that people don't leave when their taxes go up, but I'm fascinated to learn that people actually are mostly living where they grew up. Because I think what at least from an optics perspective, one of the nice things about being rich is that you could live wherever you want. You know, in my case, after my husband sold his startup, we lived in California for a couple of years when our first son was a baby, and we were thrilled to come home to BC as quickly as we could. And I can tell you, tax rates had exactly zero impact on that decision. You know, we were focused on raising our young family in a country that cared about collective well-being and where we felt safe and where our kids could access a quality public education. I don't know. There are these hyperbolic reports of wealthy people, you know, claiming they're going to flee countries to avoid taxes. But the reality is that if you are uber wealthy in Canada and your taxes go up, your lifestyle is not going to be impacted in any way by these taxes. And people choose to live in Canada because it's a great place to live. Canada has an exit tax. So if they go, they're going to pay capital gains on all their assets on the way out. And I think an interesting example we can look at fairly recently is Norway, which instituted a wealth tax. And they did lose a few dozen millionaires and billionaires. And then they tightened a bunch of loopholes on their exit tax. And now those numbers are way down.
You learn by doing, right? You go, oh, there's a little loophole we can close up. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's about time. I think we're actually past due on doing this sort of thing. And like you said, actually, the stat is only 30 people of 236,000 millionaires left Norway. 30.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in the end, their net revenue from the new tax offset those losses.
Right.
I think ultra wealthy people claim they're going to flee because they know that threat works, but I think it's a hollow threat. I think we can ignore it.
So I want to put something to you that I think is actually the more honest version of this argument. And that is rich people don't leave because of taxes. Rich people leave when they're embarrassed or when they feel unwelcome. I mean, Kevin O'Leary, thank God, has left us, hopefully out of embarrassment. And so rich people leave when sort of they feel like they're not part of the culture or when the culture turns against them. So is the real threat not tax flight, but social flight, do you think? Sort of they become ostracized to leave?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I just don't think they're going to leave, right? I mean, I don't. I think regardless of what the motivation might be, I don't think they're going to leave. You might have a few rich people who leave, kind of like what's happening with Charles Schultz in Seattle, who hasn't left as far as I know, but who's been talking a lot about leaving Seattle behind. I think there might be a few folks who do that as a statement. And ultimately, I don't know that we can really get our knickers in a knot about what a few millionaires or billionaires, where they choose to live. Also, when I look at the Norway situation, a lot of the folks who left went to Switzerland, they went to Sweden, right? Where they can go home and visit their families in Norway on a short train ride. I mean, that's just not the case here. As you said earlier, I don't know where they think they're going to go. And the problem with all of this is that unless something suddenly made Canada a terrible place to live, they're still going to find this as appealing a place to live as they ever have. And I think that ultimately they're going to grumble about it a bit. They're going to make a lot of noise, but I think a lot of them are just going to stay.
So there's a venture capitalist, John Ruffalo, and he says wealthy people should choose where their money goes. So charity, not taxation. And so what's fundamentally wrong with that model?
So this is something I think about a lot. I don't think there's anything wrong with philanthropy. I think there's very much a role for philanthropy. I give charitably. It's a joy. Like you said, it's a joy to be able to contribute to the things that are meaningful to me. My husband and I give money to the arts, education, childcare, food banks, climate action, just to name a few.
Yeah.
But when our financial situation changed, we felt an enormous sense of responsibility to do something impactful with it. And we knew we weren't going to keep it all. And there I was suddenly trying to figure out how to redistribute quite a substantial amount of money. And I found myself really uncomfortable with the idea that this was going to be my call. I mean, I happen to be a huge fan of circus, but does that mean that I should be writing massive checks in support of clown schools? I don't think that this much money should be allocated based solely on what I care about or what I think is important. And I think that comes back to what we were talking earlier about in terms of reinvestment. Because I think of it as a debt, I don't think of it as entirely my money to make those decisions about. And I don't want to play God. And I think if you extrapolate that to other wealthy Canadians, the reality is that philanthropy it's very susceptible to the whims of folks who often have life experiences and priorities that are very detached from the needs of everyday people. A lot of people respond to this gift that I've made to the CRA with, questions like, why don't you just give it to a hospital? Or there's so many people in need. Why wouldn't you give it to charity? And I definitely understand that reaction. There's so much need, and it's hard to imagine being able to kind of provide some instant relief and choosing not to. It's hard for people to square. But the more I've thought about it, the more I see that as a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage. Let me give you a food bank example. So I worked for 13 years for a food security nonprofit in my local community. We started running our local food bank during COVID. It's an incredible institution. I'm super proud of it. Food banks do phenomenal work, but they are, at the end of the day, a symptom. Food banks are a symptom of a food system and an economic system in this country that are broken. And we know that food insecurity impacts kids' mental health, their long-term physical health, and we could be a country that doesn't have food insecurity. The kind of original intent around food banks in the 80s, that this was not supposed to be a permanent fix or fixture. It was to just address some urgent need, which, by the way, is what charity is really very good at and quite different from government. There's noticing critical need, mobilizing resources, responding quickly. Charity is great at that. But instead, we're seeing the highest food bank use in history. It just keeps going up. We aren't spending the money to solve the underlying systemic issues of hunger and inequality across the country. And that's the kind of response that government is well positioned for when it has the resources and the political will. So we need long-term policy change around inequality, and we need tax revenue to pay for it. So, I give to my local food bank, but when I think about how to address the underlying systemic problems, government spending of tax revenue is the way to reach that kind of scale. And sometimes I hear from folks, people say something like, oh, I think you should give the money to, XYZ cause instead of the CRA. And what I've realized is my response to this is, right now, you don't get a vote about how I spend this money that I'm giving away. You don't get a vote about how the money most rich Canadians are giving away gets allocated. But you could have much more of a say in how that goes down. Taxing rich Canadians allows that money to be spent in a democratic way instead of leaving it up to the, personal proclivities of a small handful of individuals. So tax us and then vote for politicians who support the things you care about. It's not a perfect system, but it's by far the most effective way for the resources to be allocated in a representative way in terms of what most Canadians would choose.
First of the whole vote, please vote, it's mind-boggling to me that we keep getting these low voter turnouts. But what you mentioned about the food bank, Galen Weston, his personal net worth grew by 14% in 1 year. Grocery prices went up 27% in 5 years. And so I'm not really trusting that philanthropy is going to deal with this. If Galen Weston was taxed, we perhaps would have less people at the food bank. And I can't help but see a correlation between food bank use and Galen Weston's wealth increasing at the same time. So that's a very frustrating situation to be in. And so, yes, tax them. And you. Sorry, I feel like I'm attacking you, but yes, tax them.
No, not at all.
Tax all of them, because how people can't see the connection between these two things, it's just so obvious to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're a registered federal lobbying organization, and you're trying to change the minds of MPs and their finance minister. How's that going? I can't believe this is actually a conversation. You're trying to convince somebody to take more money. And it's a hardship. That's crazy.
I think there are moments in kind of political movements where everything coalesces, it comes together. You have the political will, you have the push from the lobby groups, and you have the general public pushing for something, and everything comes together. And so, do I think this is that moment? No. Do I think we're moving in the right direction? Yeah, I do. As we say, like, Carney is a bit of a hard to predict animal. And I think there was a real sense of momentum with Freeland's proposal just before the election. And we, as this organization came together, there was a real kind of, sense of momentum and movement in the right direction. And now I think that our emphasis is less on really pushing hard at the political level. We're still doing that, absolutely. But there's also this kind of bigger conversation we're having with just members of the public who are really trying to get their heads around what we're proposing and why it's the right answer. And you mentioned Mamdani. I think there really is a kind of growing awareness that, oh, why aren't we doing that? Like, there's this tool in the toolkit we're not using. So, yeah.
And often it's like, it's the most ridiculous thing. But today I saw a story about how Ontario is sitting on all of this alcohol from the U.S. that has been taken off the shelves.
Yes.
And I thought, sell it all and donate every dollar of it, put every dollar of it into our healthcare system. But we have a premier who's currently stripping down our healthcare system. So it's such a frustrating thing to see, when you're an engaged voter, an engaged, constituent. It's hard to see all these things happen because it just seems so easy. And apparently it's not. I don't know. It drives me crazy. So Liberals and Conservatives both ran on tax cuts in the last election. And the NDP, which was the only party that promised to raise taxes on the super rich, actually lost their official party status. So where does that leave us? Like, are we in a sort of a no man's land now until we get somebody like the NDP back in the House really driving the message?
Yeah, I think that election was not a referendum on on tax reform.
No, there's some other things going on. Yes.
And so I think that this is a long game. I think that this is a conversation that, there's a couple steps forward, there's some steps back, and we keep pushing this message. And I think more and more people are seeing what's happening in the US. They're seeing the increasing cost of living crisis and the concentration of wealth in Canada, and they're recognizing that something's got to change. So I think, as I say, I think it's a long game.
So, I mean, you've convinced me. I'm convinced. I'm sure people listening to this podcast are convinced. So who are you speaking to?
I think if you ask the average Canadian, should there be taxes on the wealthy, they would say yes. But that's not the same thing as voters making this a super high, issue when they're advocating in their communities, they're talking to their politicians. So I think part of the message is really just talking to everyday Canadians and saying, this is something that affects everyone, right? It's not a wealthy person issue. And so put it on the agenda when you're talking to your politicians and bring it to the fore of those conversations and make it harder for them to duck the issue. I think that's it. That's a big piece of it. And then I also think, I think it's also about helping people see that this is their issue. So if you care about the climate or housing or food insecurity or healthcare or education, you care about taxing the rich. If you care about continuing to live in a functioning democracy, you care about taxing the rich. And so folks need to remember there are many more of us who support wealth tax than there are those who oppose it. And I think the other kind of audience that we're reaching out to is if you happen to be someone who does find yourself in this tax bracket, then, go to patrioticmillionaires.ca and join us and, click the sign up button, learn more. I think there really is a sense of more and more people recognizing that they have an individual role to play in terms of speaking out and getting on this bus. So that's the other side of who we're talking to.
Have you ever seen Nick Hanauer's TED Talk about the pitchforks are coming? It's from many years ago.
I haven't seen it, but I know about it. People reference it all the time.
It is prescient. I mean, it really called out what was going to happen, I think. And I think that TED Talk was from 2012, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean,
right,
he really was
not a new message.
No, he was really calling out what was going to happen and, the increasing inequality and how the pitchforks would be coming. So there might be people who are hearing what you're doing and going, is this self-preservation in some way?
I mean, certainly it's self-preservation in that I think a rising tide lifts all boats. I think we are all better off.
That's my favorite expression, by the way, Emma. I love that expression. I use it all the time. So sorry, I had to just jump in.
And no, I don't mind at all, but I'm going to botch this quote of you can judge a country by how well it takes care of those who are most in need, right? So yeah, it's self-interest to want to make sure that the folks in our community have their basic needs met. Yes, that's a self-interested position to take. Is it, I don't see it as pitchfork defense. It's certainly not what I lie awake at night and think about. I look around at the country as a whole and the folks I see in my community, and I see problems, and I don't think they're impossible to solve. I don't even think they're, like you were saying, I don't think they're that hard. And so it just feels like a no-brainer to me to move some of the, resources from those who have more than they need to, I don't know, maybe it's just the mom in me, but you don't get to have a sixth cookie when someone hasn't had one yet.
Well, it does feel a little and I'm wondering if maybe you can speak to this a little bit, psychologically, what happens when you come into this kind of money, because it feels like people who are, especially the uber wealthy, the oligarchs and oligarchs out there who are oil executives, who are just billions of dollars, feels a little bit like a hoarding mentality. When they get so much money, they just want more. And I mean, like you said, you just what are you going to spend it on? How many yachts can you have? How many cars? So what is the goal? Is psychologically, does something switch for people, do you think?
I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think there is some research and some data that looks at kind of what happens to people. And I think, honestly, the reality is going to be different for different people in terms of their own way that they see themselves, their sense of their identity, what they take meaning from. I mean, I can tell you that personally, suddenly having this much money totally threw my identity into question. I really just struggled with how to reconcile the eat the rich values that I grew up with where I found myself. And I was afraid it was going to alter how people saw me and drive a wedge into my relationships. And so my first response was just a lot of secrecy. My husband and I tried to downplay or hide our situation. And then as I kind of got my head around it and gave myself a little bit of time, I realized that that wasn't a way that I wanted to live. And it just as importantly made me part of the problem. When you become wealthy, there's this whole kind of machine that kicks into gear to tell you how to protect and grow your wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Wealth managers call you, giving you unsolicited advice. And a big part of the culture of this machine is that you don't talk about wealth. It's a huge
Like the
taboo
Fight Club.
to talk about money. Totally Fight Club. I mean, even the conversation we're having today it feels a little bit like you're breaking the rules, but that silence is what keeps those systemic inequities intact. And I think the only way we can change the unfair accumulation is if we're talking about it. So I can only speak from my personal experience, but there was nothing kind of appealing to me about building a fortress around my house and hiding from, I don't know, hoarding, being a dragon. None of that appealed to me. And in fact, it threatened my sense of what I thought was important. I think between COVID and the climate crisis, people are really examining what they think is important, recognizing that community connection and interdependence are actually the values that keep us safe. And no amount of money is going to actually keep you safe, and it doesn't make you happy.
You touched on a little bit about, sort of relationships. And I mean, I imagine, you have friends and people that you associate with various socioeconomic backgrounds. What about in that super wealthy circle, though? Have you lost friends? Have you received pushback from people?
No, but I don't have a ton of super wealthy friends that I don't know because of my political affiliations, right? So most of the folks that I know with a lot of wealth sit in the same kind of political headspace that I do. So no, not at all. In fact, I have forged many new relationships by finding communities of people who want to talk about. At first, it was very lonely. It was this is confusing to me. I mean, this is not a poor little rich girl.
Yeah.
But just there really was a sort of how am I ever going to find people to talk to about how I reconcile this? And then I did find more and more people who want to have these conversations. And so there actually were some really great relationships and friendships that came out of that. I haven't lost any friends. No one's called me a class traitor and said they're never speaking to me. That hasn't happened.
This is actually very encouraging to hear that that's not happened. So that's a good thing, I think. So the name Patriotic Millionaires.
Mostly people say they think it's brave. And so I think that actually shows that a lot of the things that keep people quiet are, it's not that they disagree. It's that there's public pressure. And like we said, it's this huge taboo, right? So.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, it's taboo to, I'm not going to compare my situation to yours, but it's taboo for those of us down here in the trenches who are sort of treading water to keep our head up above things, to even talk about money. That money carries taboo. It's a great thing to sort of peel away those layers and have open, honest conversations about it. So I think it's great. So the name Patriotic Millionaires is deliberately provocative, I think. It's saying that paying taxes is an act of patriotism. So do you believe that?
Absolutely. I absolutely believe that.
So, and if nothing changes in the next 10 years, if Canada does nothing on wealth taxes, what do you think the future looks like?
Well, I think that So I grew up in the US. I moved here as a teenager, and I have a lot of kind of intuitive vibes sense of the difference between the two countries and the difference between the two cultures. I think there are a lot of ways in which Canada and the US are very different. That said, I do think what's happening in the US is a canary in the coal mine of what happens when the income disparity keeps growing and that kind of hoarding of wealth isn't checked. I think one of the things that is maybe kind of underneath what we're talking about is that the most dangerous part of wealth inequality is that at a certain point, wealth becomes political power. And as we creep closer and closer to something more akin to an oligarchy than a democracy, I think there is a bit of a tipping point. I think we're seeing that in the US, and it gets harder to come back from. So, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know exactly what would happen if we just maintain the status quo for the next 10 years. But I think we definitely have the ability to act now. And I do think that it's not a gamble I really want us to take to say, well, what happens if we just don't do it? That seems too risky to me.
And, I think I could talk to you forever, but we would go down a million rabbit holes. But, I think about somebody like Peter Thiel, who put out a manifesto recently, which was absolutely unhinged and insane. And if it was some dude on the street, you would try to commit him. But because he has so much wealth and so much influence, he just continues to go about his business, causing damage to the social fabric of a lot of democracies around the world. His hands, Palantir, is sort of into everything. And so those are the things that keep me awake at night, is sort of moving from a democracy to to technocrats who want to have their vision of them running the world rather than who was voted for. Those are the things that are disturbing, and I hope we can pull back from that.
Absolutely. Me too. I don't know if you've caught the recent CBC Ideas series on billionaires, but I totally recommend it to folks. And I think it's a 3-part series. The second part is Abigail Disney, who's one of the heirs to the Disney fortune, and who is one of the founders of the US Patriotic Millionaires. And she talks really clearly in that second episode about how our culture has, over the last several decades, moved toward really putting wealth on a pedestal. And I think it's one of those things that once you kind of call it out, you look at it and you think, but why? That most of these people have not done anything anywhere near to justify the accumulation. And it's there's this kind of thing in the water now, or in the ether, where maybe many people who are struggling kind of imagine that they're one day they're going to be those people, right? They're going to be the next tech millionaire. And I think that has really distorted the way people think about, it's just kind of like their role in society and how society functions. I think it's time for us to shift away from that. I think that's not working for us very well. So
clearly. So what do you want people to walk away from after this conversation? And I mean, it feels like a weird ask, but I mean, how can we support you? I mean, I don't know how we support you in this. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm just down here struggling to, pay my bills, and I don't know how to help millionaires pay their taxes, So I don't know. What are you hoping?
Yeah, I mean, I think most working Canadians, as we were talking about, it's about the conversations you have with your representatives and putting this on the political agenda. It's, Patriotic Millionaires is not asking for donations. Like, that's not.
Thank you.
I'm hoping that the act, this, kind of public act that I've taken, I'm hoping that it helps Canadians maybe just kind of take a second look at what your response is when you hear the word taxation. We have, largely thanks to some of the politicians in the 80s, I think we have this kind of gut response about taxation as evil. And I think that fair taxation is not evil. And so I think there is a little bit of a I'm proud to pay my taxes when my taxes are fair, when the wealthy are carrying their fair share. And so, I mean, I think really what I would ask people to do is just have this conversation with the people in your life if you have people in your life who have money, then I think absolutely have this conversation with them, but definitely have this conversation with your politicians.
Emma, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. This was a really great conversation, and I'm glad you were so open and honest about things. So I'm going to ask you as a final question. do you want to share how you came into your wealth? I haven't asked through this whole thing. I wasn't sure if you wanted to share, but would you like to share?
I'm totally happy to talk about that. I mean, you can't really embark on this without expecting those questions. Like I mentioned, I didn't grow up with money. My parents were both, lefty artists who were deeply involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And then I married my husband, who grew up middle class. And a few years out of college, he launched a startup that was eventually acquired. And then a few years after that, our stock options were suddenly very valuable. And now my family is part of the 0.1% of wealth holders in Canada.
All right. Excellent. Emma, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people go to find out more about Patriotic Millionaires, website, any social channels they can follow?
Yeah, patrioticmillionaires.ca, and basically all the social channels we're out there, Patriotic Millionaires Canada.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Candace. It was great to chat with you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to share it with someone who'd love it too. And don't forget to hit subscribe to What She Said with me, Candace Sampson, on your favorite podcast app. It's the easiest way to stay connected. Want more? Sign up for my newsletter at whatshesaidtalk.com to get all the latest updates, and let's keep the conversation going on social. You can find What She Said on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll find me on Threads, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Candace Said. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.